Hello, is this a meeting for the Montgomery County Police Commission?
Hi, is that Terry?
Yes, it is.
Oh, wow, I got you right. This is Susan. Yes. I was just about to ask Lieutenant Jensen if we should get started.
Okay. I'm driving with my head bobs in, so anyway, I'm not home from work yet.
Gotcha.
As soon as I get home, I'll jump on the computer and do Teams, but cannot do that right now.
Hi, Susan. It's Tanisha.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
Good.
Does it look like we have everyone?
We do not. I heard from Chair Bellamy, and he's not going to be able to join tonight. But this is supposed to be recorded, correct?
It is, yes.
Okay,
And
so
the recording, I believe, has already started. Sergeant Mullane.
Okay. Great. Well, then we can just make sure that that recording is available to those who can't attend tonight.
Okay, will do. I am going to be an observer, if that's okay with everyone.
Okay.
I'm going to turn the floor over here to Officer Cox. Are you leading, or is there someone else from your unit that's doing your presentation tonight?
No, that's actually me this evening. I believe Captain Statinsky and Lieutenant Inisetti are pulled away for something else. So I've been asked.
All right. Well, and we also have our civilian deputy director, Eric Reist. He's also online as well. He's the deputy director for our training academy. So I think, is there an agenda, Susan? I'm sorry, I'm kind of doing this off the cuff. I apologize.
No, we do not have an agenda. I really do appreciate Mr. Reist's availability tonight. Would it be okay if we started with you, and if you could just give a little bit of overview of who you are and what your new position is with the department?
Absolutely. Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. My name is Eric Reist, and I'm excited to meet the Advisory Commission on Policing this evening. I really want to start by saying thank you, right? Those are two words we don't hear enough, but really thank you for your commitment and time. I believe that is crucial to the enhancement of the department's relationship with our neighbors and those whom we have the privilege to serve. I have been a professional team member here since August of 2024. I believe my first day was the first training session that you all started to have with the Education and Training Division being August 12th. So I'm glad to finally be able to meet all of you. Over the next few minutes, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to share some of my initial observations, my experience, and then how I will be supporting the community and the department in the months to come. I want to first start out with how proud I am of this department and this community, and I've really been able to hit the ground running. I can't believe I've only been here since August. I feel like I've learned so much, and we've been able to really do a lot. The vision for my position really does demonstrate the county and the department's and the community's commitment to forward thinking, the integration of a professional team member such as myself within the department's education and training division. I think, Lieutenant Jensen, I heard her saying the other day how she reverts back to so many things she learned in the academy, which was a minute or two ago. And so having, again, a community member engaged with our brand new entry-level police officer candidates, and even before that, our explorers and our police cadets, I think will continue to yield positive reinforcement to what we're trying to achieve as a team going forward in the future. My spouse is a former police officer for a very large police agency, so I have really had a front row seat to the challenges that communities face as they engage in thought about what community-informed law enforcement looks like in their neighborhoods. My passion for public service, my innovative thought, education, and training, and love, again, for public policy and community engagement is really why I applied for this position. And I am honored and humbled to really be trusted with the immense responsibility of I kind of break them out into 5 major areas. The first being reviewing the department's educational and training offerings, right? Seeing what we're doing today. Creating and modifying educational and training offerings that support the community's needs. What we need here in Montgomery County may be different than what we need in Washington State, or what we need, or different than what we need in Fairfax, or in the District of Columbia. And then the standardization of our education and training, really making sure that our lesson plans, our PowerPoints, our curriculum, our course catalog is all standardized, with the goal of expanding our partnerships with institutions of higher education. And the last one is really supporting the personal and professional development of the department, including our entry-level law enforcement officer candidates, our experienced law enforcement professionals, and the law enforcement supervisors, leaders, and executives. With that, I really have found this department to be very forward-thinking and inclusive and welcoming. Lieutenant Jensen's office is on the other side of my wall, and just a door down or so is Captain Reed. We all share an administrative office space together, and this leads to honest and open communication between myself, Captain Reed, and my colleague, Lieutenant Jensen, about the efforts that we have underway and our investment in education and training. I'm a researcher, right? So I'm getting my PhD. I like to say I've taken over 100 college classes. That's a lot. I'm a researcher by nature. And so one of my commitments is to research and make sure we are implementing data-based, evidence-supported education and training offerings that benefit our community and ensure that public safety services can be provided across our diverse neighborhoods. I have had this opportunity to kind of work. So who is Eric Reese, right? So I've been able to work with innovative and spirited and caring service-oriented organizations throughout my almost 20-year career. And one of my first achievements in public safety was the creation of an emergency communications analyst course and program, one of the first in the nation, and was very proud of that effort. I was able to serve in healthcare during COVID-19 and lead an amazing emergency response team. And eventually we were recognized for our achievements by me earning the Emergency Management Professional of the Year award for the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. And lastly, I am a proud United States Air Force veteran. Captain Reed is a proud Marine veteran, and Sergeant Mullaney, a proud Army veteran. So in our little suite, we got the services covered. But in the Air Force, I was able to contribute to my nation's efforts as a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, CBRN, emergency management, EM, hazardous material, hazmat, and weapons of mass destruction, WMD, responder, instructor, and educational leader. I was trusted to deliver over 4,000 instructional hours to 1,100 students throughout the world over 4 years, which represented responsibility for about 40% of all Air Force formal training related to my career field. And lastly, I am a PhD candidate at the University of the District of Columbia, which provides me a unique perspective. It is a historically Black college and university. And my specialty is in urban leadership and entrepreneurial mindsets. And my research focus does support the department's efforts here, as it is focused on governmental policy impact for urban community sustainability and resilience as it relates to crises, disasters, emergencies, and incidents. My research interests, as I'm sure you can guess, are span my professional career. So they might be found in criminal justice, emergency management, homeland security, law enforcement, organizational and community education, leadership and training, public safety, and then resilience and sustainability. And lastly, I'll conclude with a little personal note about me. I'm from the great state of Iowa. I'm a huge Iowa Hawkeyes fan, and I know I'm in rival Big Ten territory here with the Terps nearby in College Park. But I have been a Washingtonian off and on for 10 years. So I'd also venture to guess that we probably don't support the same professional sports teams either. And I am really excited about our initiatives that are centered around supporting the community. We are really looking at how we integrate an informed perspective into our education and training offerings. And then lastly, strengthening our existing relationships with those higher education institutions and other training providers. For example, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, FLETC, will be here in March of 2025 to offer a week-long Leadership for Women in Law Enforcement program at the PSTA, and we are extremely proud to host them. As we partner and engage in dialogue, I think it's really crucial to us that our education and training offerings reflect the diversity of the community. And that includes our entry-level law enforcement candidates. The current ones in session 78 are among the most diverse students we have had, and this reflects the department's ongoing commitments. And I also think that we are thinking beyond just today and tomorrow. I think every day, what will our communities look like and reflect in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and beyond years? And how does our education and training need to support our officers of tomorrow? For example, Lieutenant Jensen never thought about responding to an active threat or shooter situation in a school when she came through the academy many, many years ago. But that is an environment that our students and our children and our parents and our law enforcement providers face today. So what might our communities and our officers face tomorrow? I want to thank you for the privilege of your time, and I welcome and embrace the opportunity to answer any questions you may have for me.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to meet you. I'm not sure if anybody has questions, or perhaps they could also put them in the chat if they come up. And the other thing I might hit you with is some follow-up questions after the fact, if I can collate them from the commission and send them your way. So I really do appreciate your introduction and really look forward to meeting with you and working with you.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure I put my contact information in the chat. So feel free to call me, text me, email me, and engage with me in any way you're comfortable with.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Eric. That was a very extensive pedigree that you had there. The only two things that I issue with is I'm Battle and Go Terps. But it's been a pleasure so far working with Eric. Like you said, I can't believe it's only been a little over 2 months, but he has definitely hit the ground running. So he's been a welcome addition to our staff here at the Training Academy. So thank you again, Eric. All right. So Susan, did you just want to collect questions for Eric, or do you want to hold them till the end, or?
Does anybody have any questions right now? Otherwise, we can send them back. So, and we can just ask Officer Cox. Oh, I think Eva's got their hand up.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for coming to talk with us. I asked this the last time we met with MCPD, but I'm going to ask it again to a different branch of the office, which is, you know, we're talking about crisis response, dealing with mental health, right? Obviously, there was a very notable and tragic case of MCPD being involved in a mental health incident earlier this year in May, I think, with Bishop Jones. So I want to ask, you know, how is training going to change as a result of that? Is training going to change as a result of that? And what has been the department's sort of internal response in responding in the aftermath of that incident?
I want to thank you for offering that question, and I will pass portions of it off to Lieutenant Jensen for any further. First, I want to start from my perspective, which is the loss of any human life, the loss of the individuals that interact with law enforcement, and what their families and neighbors and community experience and face. Most certainly is something that we must recognize. And then everything I look at is I'm constantly reviewing officer involved body-worn camera and training and things from throughout the nation, not just the DMV, but also things, again, throughout the nation. And one of the things that we are working on here is really the energized synchronization of our ICAT, our Integrated Communications Assessment training, across our entire curriculum. And beyond that, one of the things that I am focusing on is, as I look at education and training, I always say that law enforcement training should incorporate skill for de-escalation, decision-making, diversity, communication, critical thinking, officer health, wellness, and resilience, and then problem-solving capability. To aid us in that, we are proud to partner with Georgetown in continuing to strengthen our relationship with them for the active bystander law enforcement program that they offer, and how that can provide our police officer candidates and experienced officers with additional education and training. And lastly, looking at case studies throughout the United States, the Naval Postgraduate Center and the Center for Homeland Defense Security Studies does lots of research on law enforcement incidences throughout the nation, and they have an academic and university partnership agreement. And I'm proud to say that since I have arrived in the department, that we now share and utilize resources with them so we can get enhanced curriculum that helps address some of those challenges to ensure that we have crisis intervention trained officers and that they can appropriately and adequately engage with the members that they are privileged to engage with. So that is my answer from an academic perspective, but I will pause and see if Lieutenant Jensen has any additional information for you.
Yes, thank you, Eric. So in response to that, one of the things that I like to highlight, that I highlight often, is we here at the Training Academy, I mean, that's what we do, right? We're in the business of training, of evolving, of seeing, you know, kind of like Eric had mentioned earlier when he was talking, things have changed. You know, I've been on for 26 years, and a lot of the tactics, a lot of scenarios, whatever it is that we trained on 26 years ago, obviously that doesn't always work for 2024, right? Population has changed. Just basically the landscape of the county has changed. So I pride myself on, and this is long before I became the deputy director at the Training Academy, that Montgomery County is very progressive and forward thinking. We're always sending officers, we're sending current full-time staff members for training. I'm going to a training myself tomorrow, being the deputy director, to always evolve. Speaking directly, but not too specifically, because the case is still open, on that referenced incident, I am a crisis negotiator. I have been for the last 12 years. And what I can say directly is we do after action reviews. We do debriefs, but really I feel like that word doesn't really give it justice, right? Because we take a deep dive into what happened, the things that were done correctly, things that may not have necessarily, I don't want to say not been done correctly, but just things that we can change, that we can learn from and adapt from. So we do that methodically. Everything is very transparent. That's why we, you know, our executives do review of body worn cameras. I am an executive. Like I said, I've been a negotiator for the last 12 years. I came up as a negotiator, a team leader, and I sit on the executive ranks of the negotiating team. Myself and two other lieutenants and a captain who actually has been a negotiator. Commander Palace has been with us for over 22 years as a negotiator. So with those things in mind, it's not a one and done. It's not a, okay, hey, we did that, let's go on to the next one. We're always looking at ways of how we can improve, learning from each other, learning from internal training, as well as exploring any external training that there is. I'm sorry, is that Francisco? Is your hand up?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to both of you for your answers. But I just wanted to mention, and I understand that you may not be able to be very specific at all, in fact, about your response. But I think Ava's question is one that needs to be answered at some point with specificity. Either we've looked at it and we've decided not to make any changes in our training, or we've looked at it and we decided to make these changes. And so I understand that you can't answer with specifics now, but I think at some point we would like to hear a more specific response.
Absolutely. I think, though, that can only come, though, after the investigation by the independent committee has been finalized, for us to see what it is that we can adapt and what we can change. So my answer is yes. I know that happened in May. We're talking about roughly 5 months ago. However, we have debriefed, we have discussed it as much as we can. Obviously, like I said, the investigation is still open. It's pending. It's outside of our hands of Montgomery County Police. So we have to wait until those findings and that review is back. And then from there, there will be further discussion, and I will be more than happy to provide any specifics that I can at that time.
Thank you.
I do have a question. So I just wanted to, I'm one of the newest commissioners on the ACP, right? So it's a learning, there's a learning curve associated with it, but I just have one question: that how often is the training program being updated? And what triggers an update to the training program? Do you look at the trend, or is it isolated incident? Or there can be isolated incidents, right? Then you don't want to train the police officer based on one isolated incident. If you're seeing a trend, that means that there is something going on, right? So my question is, what triggers an update to the training program, and how often does that get updated?
Yes, thank you for your question. So with our training commission, with MPCTC, there are certain things that we have to train on, whether it's yearly or biannually. So we adhere to that. And yes, exactly what you said. We look at trends. We look at trends, whether we're training within our own organization, if we're trending in the area amongst other police agencies, or even nationally. Okay, so for example, we'll take George Floyd back in 2020, right? A lot of change to training. If it was use of force, that was when Eric spoke about ICAT, introducing that program to give our officers ways to diffuse and de-escalate a situation. So yes, a lot of it is largely based on trends. Another portion of it is based on what we're mandated to. That state training commission holds all of police agencies in the state of Maryland to a certain standard. So obviously we meet that standard. And again, as I said before, I know I sound very biased in saying this, especially being the deputy director of the training academy, but our department has always been very forward thinking, always very progressive. So one of the things that I want to highlight is we have certain minimums that we have to train on as far as training hours, and we always exceed that. So whether that's in our in-service for our incumbent officers, if that's in our entry-level program for our police recruits, and even in the last couple of years, we've really been expanding that training to our cadets, which are our college students who may be considering a law enforcement career, whether it's with us or another agency. So that's basically how we focus our training and I mean, like I said, being at the training academy myself for the last 2 years, it's a lot that you don't know when you're outside of the building. But when you're in the building and you see the rigorous training that goes on, and we have a really highly skilled staff that they're always thinking, they're always preparing. Like right now, it's October, but we're already preparing for our training for 2025. And that's all of our units. That's across our in-service unit, our de-escalation and use of force unit. We're introducing things like this year. We brought in virtual reality training. We brought in pepper ball, just different things to make sure that we're on the cutting edge and that we're serving our community.
Got it. I do have a follow-up to that, what I asked. So I know that Eric's office looks at the data and identifies training trends and other things. Then how does it get translated into a training program? Is it he works with his own team inside his office? And if so, what are the trends that you are currently looking at, right? So
I'm going to pass that to Eric.
Great question. I'll answer it in kind of two parts. The first is the entry-level program. Those are the brand new police officer candidates. Some things can be very quickly integrated, but as Lieutenant Jensen alluded to, having MPCTC training requirements those are very heavy on brand new entry-level police officer candidates. And so there's certain things we can do. We sent an officer to training not long ago. They were able to come back and say, hey, this was great training, and let's integrate this into our academy. And we were able to do that in the first couple of weeks without a lot of movement. But if we're talking about adding additional, weeks of training, time doesn't necessarily allow that. And so we have to look at it, engagement, to say, hey, what are we currently spending our time on? And then what do we need to maybe reinvest that time on in the future? So I currently sit and watch a lot of the entry-level candidates. I don't just read the PowerPoint and the lesson plan. I want to see how that training is being delivered and how it is being received by the student. The second piece is our in-service training. So as Lieutenant Jensen brought up, I have partnered with our our in-service unit and our force training unit, the de-escalation unit that is the newest to our team here. And we've already looked at some new case law and use of forces in Maryland. And they are integrating that into their training for 2025. So these are incidences that have happened. The findings have been dropped from the independent investigator for the state of Maryland. And we're now going to teach those in our force training unit to ensure that our officers understand the law and any law changes and how they apply that. So that's very immediate. The other thing we do is look at our terminology and our course descriptions. And one of the things for 2025 that we'll see is all of those MPCTCP numbers, so program approval numbers through the state of Maryland, will be approved ultimately by me before we submit them up to the state. And so that ensures that, hey, what we're training follows best practices, industry standards. And the other piece is theory. There should be a theory attached to what we're teaching, right? There's lots of theories out there, education theories, criminal justice theories, learning theories, public safety theories, community theories, legitimacy theory. But we want to really look at what we're doing from a higher education perspective and say, why are we ascribing to what we ascribe to? So sometimes the police officers and our instructors don't know that they're speaking theory, and they really are, because as Lieutenant Jensen said, they're premier and they're on top of this stuff. And so a lot of times I'm like, hey, did you know that is this technical theory? And they're like, nope, didn't know that's the name for it, but knew that that was based by evidence. So we're including a lot of that as well. And then it's what are our peers doing, constantly evaluating what's happening in DC, Virginia, and Maryland. And then beyond that, on the East Coast, and then the Mid-Eastern states, and then again across America, to see if someone has something to offer us. And honestly, I spend far too much time researching, but have been able to really look at that as we standardize our training.
So in some cases, even after you do the training, do you collect the feedback from the officers to see whether that really helped them, or is it hindering them from doing their duty, right? So sometimes it can be constraining too, right? So if you run it completely by the data, right? So
yes, one of the first things I got here, I knew the brand new session 77 was going to be leaving the building shortly. I conducted feedback with them with very specific questions to make sure that we're capturing that. And then we will be evaluating. We have a QR code that all of our officers can scan at any time. We have it posted in multiple locations throughout our academy where they can share their feedback anonymously with us to ensure that we are meeting student-centered learning principles, right? So not only that, but our feedback should be student-centered. So it's not just applying educational theories of student-centered learning. We execute that in our feedback. We don't start with criticizing the student. We ask the student how they feel about the scenario or the interaction that they had. They walk us through it. They know their training. They know what they did well and they can improve on. We let them tell us that before we tell them that. And then we support them in developing subconscious files and human performance factors to prevent them from making those mistakes in the future and to have better interactions going forward. And again, it's not just student-centered feedback in terms of providing it to them, but also everything we do here should be based on the community and the students we serve. And so we will be continuing to look at how we engage with them to enhance that.
Thank you.
I think there's one more question from Ms. Branson, and then we should move on to Officer Cox's presentation, please.
Sorry, I wanted to just briefly follow up on Eva's question. And so it's twofold. One, I believe the essence of her question had to do with how and when is training reformatted based on incidents and a specific incident. And so the answer was that this particular incident she referenced had not been was not at that stage yet. So nothing had been. So let me back up and ask a different way, and then I have a different question. Can you point to any specific incidents that led to a change in training, like over the last, I don't know, 2, 3, 5, however many years? And if so, what was that, and what were those changes? I know that's kind of on the spot. I'm not trying to give you a pop quiz. And secondly, and so you may have to get back to us with that. Secondly, what I heard, what I thought I heard was that the training curriculum is in fact forwarded to the Maryland State folks. And I was a little confused as to whether this is a new thing or whether it's an ongoing thing. What is the interchange, if you will, between Montgomery County Police Department training and the Maryland State Police Department, or Maryland State Police requirements? How does that interaction occur? What have yeah, that, let's just start there. How does that interaction occur? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start off, and then Eric, I'll let you kind of fine tune what I have to say here. So yes, I think I was speaking in terms of the Maryland Police Training Commission, not Maryland State Police, which Maryland State Police falls under them. But we have a training commission that's located in Sykesville that is kind of, think about it as the ruling body for all law enforcement agencies in the state of Maryland. So they communicate to us what it is that we need to include in our training on a yearly basis. So we have constant communication with them. I know with me being the deputy director of the training academy, I have constant communication with them. These are standards that our officers have to meet in order to recertify every year as a police officer, and for our recruits to meet for graduation, to be considered certified in the state of Maryland. So my apologies if I wasn't clear on that. Not Maryland State Police, but it's MPC, so Maryland Police and Corrections Training Commission, MPCTC. As far as, I may have to get back to you on this one because I don't want to misspeak, but as far as anything that has occurred that has caused us to tailor our training, I mean, I did speak on George Floyd. I think that's a pretty big, nationwide case where it really had us reevaluate our use of force policy, had us reevaluate what we were doing. Not that we were doing anything wrong or incorrectly, but again, we just want to make sure that we are delivering the best services that we can to the county, to the community that we serve. Okay, so we've always taught de-escalation techniques. That is something I can say that I learned 26 years ago when I was in the training academy. But and just to speak very frank, that's kind of become like the buzzword in the last couple of years. But that's something that I can say Montgomery County, we've always taught. But bringing in like ICAT, for example, integrating communication and tactics, that's a game changer. I will say that. That's a game changer even for an old head such as myself, because it really teaches you in a lot of cases and scenarios that you don't always, as a police officer, you don't have to create that moment with that person. right? That you can back out of the situation, you can call for backup, you can slow things down and use time as your friend. I think we've seen in some national cases where maybe that wasn't always the case, and officers may have, and I'm not trying to be the Monday morning quarterback here and the judge and jury, but they may have rushed the actual situation, and it turned out untimely for everyone, right? So, like I said before, we look at trends, whether they're local, especially if they're national, and we try to adapt our training to that. We try to get ahead of it. And I like to say we don't have a lot of incidents in Montgomery County where we have to change our training and our ways because we're already ahead of it. We're already forward thinking. Eric.
Yeah, the only part I'll echo there from Lieutenant Jensen is, my title says academic instruction. Some people think that's a classroom, but I like to say, for those of us familiar with their college, I'm like the chief academic officer, right? And then, which is kind of academic affairs. So one of the team members that I have the privilege of supporting is responsible for submitting all of our what we call P number approvals to the state, or program approvals to the state. And we've been able to, again, really track that. And so not everything we instruct or we teach may be a P number course, which means that we're not meeting a state requirement for in-service hours or entry-level training or firearms training, or you name it. Maybe it's a course on, human dynamics, and it doesn't fit in a category that we need a P number for from the Maryland Police Corrections and Training Commission. But if we can get the officers, because officers have in-service training requirements, and we want to be able to document on their career the training that they've received, we will work to see if we can get a P number for the course, if one is required, or we can even, again, make it apply in a category. And that is kind of an ongoing thing. And I know that we're, again, constantly, as we look at these things, and, you ask for specific examples, and, our force training unit, I was watching one of their instructors the other day go through a dry run in a course of what they're going to be doing in 2025 based on new stuff. I can't remember the specific incident in Maryland that drove them to incorporate that scenario into their training. But it is a nearby incident, maybe in Anne Arundel County or one of those. Again, I can't remember the specific incident, but that's happening all the time. And again, for our in-service unit, they're building on that stuff time and time again. But a recent example, within the past few years, we look at the Reimagining Public Safety task force, and then the Effective Law Enforcement for All audit. Our department did a huge holistic sweep across our curriculum to ensure that we are teaching a guardian mindset instead of a warrior mindset. And so that is a recent example of a very specific example of ensuring that our training is focused on being community guardians versus a warrior mentality, which might create a warrior mentality, might create a us versus them relationship between officers and the community, where a guardian mindset says, hey, we are here for the community and we are here for public service. We're here to interact with you and engage with you to deliver these public safety services. Again, a completely different mindset than the warrior mentality. And that's something that we, again, looked at within the last few years to specifically ensure that that is not in our curriculum. And again, that our curriculum is focused on a guardian mindset instead of a warrior mentality.
I appreciate that. So I've just been trying to understand, how, and I really appreciate the switch from the warrior to the guardian mentality. And yet I assume that people have been trained to be warriors for quite some time. And so I'm wondering how you can measure whether the new theoretical underpinning takes, that's a whole different ball of wax. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying about making that kind of change, and I think it's necessary. So like, how do you know it's working?
That's a great question, and that is one of the reasons why partnering with higher education institutions is so important. The ABLE project through Georgetown helps look at some of that data from throughout the nation, and all of the agencies they've partnered with. They've been able to identify some of those key performance indicators and KPIs. So as we get ready to roll out that training department wide, one of the things we have to look at is what data do we currently collect, and then what data do we need to be collecting to evaluate the effectiveness of this program. Lieutenant Jensen spoke to ICAT. We know ICAT is successful because of an immense amount of data and research that has been conducted on it throughout the world. But that takes time. And so introducing those things and then evaluating them, not just for immediate impact, but true organizational and cultural competencies takes time. Things that we might not see for 5 years or even longer. And so, again, being able to track those KPIs from initial through the midterm and even the long term, and how they influence an officer's career, again, not just 5, 10, or 15 years, but throughout their entire career. And then how do we undo that, right? We learn things different in all walks of life, whether it's policing or teaching or social work or medicine. And so how do we unteach what is old and then reteach initiatives that are new, and introduce those to our officers? Again, this department being on the forward thinking allows us to maybe do that a little sooner than some other departments. But at the same time, we do want to make sure that we are introducing things that are based on data. And if that data is not available, then we need to make sure it's based on sound theory to then implement it. And then how do we track that data to ensure it is successful as we integrate it throughout our community?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I still didn't get the answer to the question of how do you unteach it? That's really sort of the essence of it. How do you unteach it?
Very quickly, we look at what's called human performance things. And so I was just at MPCTC for some training on this. We are always building files in our memory, conscious files, subconscious files, and we rely on them all the time. So we drive to work and we really sometimes don't realize how we got there. We're on autopilot. We, might be an hour-long drive, but it doesn't feel that way by the time we get to work, right? And that's producing those files. And then how do we do that? It's by reintegrating new training scenarios. So that integration from what we teach in entry level should be what we teach in in-service. When things change, we need to hit on those during our in-service training, the 18 to 21 hours we provide the officer every year. We hit during in-service to retrain the brain from a human performance perspective, to build new files to how we want the officer to be able to interact and engage in a certain scenario. Very quickly, police officers used to dive into their cars or behind doors when there was an exchange of weapon fire. What we've learned is that officers are actually safer behind the vehicle. And so we reteach that, and we hit that, and we have the psychomotor drills to re-engage that. And when we change things, such as position of certain things or certain individuals in training, we're going through our force training unit is going through constant scenarios with the students to re-engage the human mind, and again to rebuild those conscious and subconscious files to change the human performance at the end. So that is kind of how it's done, and I'm happy to share with you some of the resources offline and the data and papers that kind of speak to those human performance factors and how we, again, retrain for new files and reintroduce them through repetitive education and training and reinforcement, again, to rebuild those files so the officer responds in a manner in which comes second nature to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really want to thank you for all of those informative answers. And I wrote in the chat, we will follow up with additional questions, but they may also want to invite you back for a separate standalone meeting. So I hope that might be okay. But I'd love to flip it over to Officer Cox now to do the CIT update, please.
Hi, I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Make sure that works for everybody. Is everybody seeing that? Yes, no?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for allowing me to come and as we at least provide a little bit more information regarding CIT, mental health, and kind of our role within the department. So I always kind of tease when I teach because I think it's boring if I'm always the one that's always talking. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. But I'll try to be as respectful to your time as well. But as we go through, so I'm Officer Kelly Cox. I've been actually with the department for 8 years. Before I actually was a police officer, I worked in forensic psych as a supervisor. So those are individuals that are deemed not criminally responsible. So they've gone through the legal process and then they've actually been deemed not criminally responsible. So then they become actually like within a forensic hospital. And I've worked in acute psych before that. So I have a lot of experience within the psychiatric world and field as a whole, especially with training. So currently I serve at our centralized crisis intervention team. And so that actually falls under our field services bureau under Assistant Chief McBain. And under that, under the community engagement division with Captain Satinsky and Lieutenant Pinacetti, which he oversees a few things, including the community engagement section and our crisis response support section, which is where we fall. Under that, you have the crisis intervention team. So this is our centralized team that's led by Sergeant Skidmore. And we have 5 police officers underneath that and a licensed clinician social worker who joined us roughly about 6 weeks ago. Also under that umbrella is the Autism IDD Alzheimer's Dementia Outreach Unit, and then the Behavioral Assessment and Administrative Unit. Centralized CIT right now is a dedicated centralized team of sworn officers, CIT officers, that work alongside with the Department of Health and Human Services, clinicians with the most acute cases. A dedicated HHS clinician is embedded into the CIT unit, whose focus centers on closing the gaps between public safety resources and the mental health system. We're available resource to patrol officers, specialized units, and outside agencies. We're currently in service. We're responding to active calls Monday through Friday, roughly 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then we're on call at other times. And officers designated to each district, but available countywide. Currently, the type of training that we receive, in addition to other basic training, some receive negotiator training, basic investigator school, critical incident stress management, and then most of us are instructors to the state. So just as a brief overview of like mental illness, and part of this is also part of the segment that we teach not only our entry-level officers, but also in our CIT class. So under the DSM, the definition of mental disorder, it defines a mental disorder as a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognitive, emotion regulation, or behavior. So NAMI posts information regarding statistics on mental illness and how many individuals are impacted by it. Like they provide information regarding 1 in 5 Americans will have a diagnosable mental health condition in any given year. 46% of Americans will meet criteria, the DSM criteria, for a diagnosable mental health condition in their lifetime, and 4% of Americans have suicidal thoughts. Really, the takeaway is that mental illness as a whole is one that doesn't discriminate regarding gender, race, socioeconomic class. It's one thing that really impacts almost every aspect of our community. Mental illness, really through the National Institute of Mental Health, they fall into 2 categories, which is any mental illness, which is mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder, can vary in impact ranging from no impact to mild, moderate, and even severe impairment. Severe mental illness, which is really the individuals that we really deal with, is defined by mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. Statistics say that in 2022, it represented 6% of all U.S. adults. Common types of mental disorders that we see are thought disorders and really mood disorders. Thought disorders are impaired capacity to sustain coherent discourse and occurs in the patient's written or spoken language. People with schizophrenia or other delusional disorders. And then mood disorders which changes in mood that don't have the usual connection with what is occurring, bipolar, depression, and anxiety disorders. One thing that we're very aware of within our unit is, and really kind of dictates in how we approach different individuals and different types of calls, are the mental health laws in Maryland. So they fall under the general health code. And really, when we look at like voluntary admission and involuntary admission, it's important for us to understand what we're looking for and where we fall in to this as a whole as a police officer, because that really kind of dictates what we do and what we don't do. So one thing, as you can understand, like voluntary admissions, I think the law changes of last year where it no longer was 16 was age of consent, but actually reduced down to 12. 12-year-olds can now consent to their own treatment, which is great if you have some parents that are resistant to having their child into treatment. That they have to have a mental disorder, is susceptible to care or treatment, understands the nature of the request, able to give continuous consent, assent, and then able to ask for release. Involuntary admission is one that we handle more as police, because those are the types of calls that we're going to respond to. And then really when individuals are an imminent danger to themselves or others, or their judgment is so impaired that they require hospitalization, and they're unable or unwilling to be in treatment. So for us, we have what we call emergency evaluation petitions, and that's really stating that someone has a mental disorder and it presents a danger to the life or safety of the individual or others. That's really suicidal, homicidal, or gross impaired judgment. And then what that allows is that we are allowed to, through an emergency evaluation petition, take that individual to a hospital for immediate assessment by a clinician. So within the state, how they dictate who can petition. You can read physicians, psychologists, clinical social workers. Those individuals can. A peace officer, which would be us, we can on scene, as well as any other interested party. What that looks like is that any person can go down to the commissioner and they can apply for an emergency evaluation petition, and they can submit it stating that they believe that for this information that this individual is a danger to themselves or others. In those cases, those are handed over to the sheriff's office and they are served by their special victims unit. They have a team that goes and serves emergency petitions, and those actually they have 5 days for that. Other clinicians can complete the emergency petition and then they request for an officer because we actually have to transport to a local hospital. But if we come into contact with an individual who's demonstrating these behaviors, these traits to us as police officers, as peace officers, we can petition on site. So what does the police role look like? It says we shall take an emergency evaluation to the nearest emergency facility. If we feel like they are a danger to themselves or others, we will take them to the closest hospital. We aren't regulated kind of by if they're accepting patients, we just have to take them to the closest hospital. And then if another clinician has endorsed the EAP, then we shall take them to the hospital. We also have the right to make sure that they understand that the complexity and of that EAP when we take them into custody, because it is a pretty serious situation. But then that allows us to take them to be evaluated. And then it's up to the evaluation at the hospital, that next step. So if you guys haven't seen this before, this is actually an emergency evaluation petition. This actually, if you were to apply for it within the commissioner, it looks exactly the same as we would fill out on site, and any clinician from their practice as well. The one thing, once we take them to the hospital, the EAP is what we call served. Emergency petition is then served, and then it is up to the clinical team at the hospital to decide what that next step is. Really, the mental health laws within Maryland really focus on the individual rights of the individual and keeping them having their rights. So if someone's willing to go to treatment, they really want to allow them to go to treatment on their own accord. It's kind of like the more drastic measure would be what we call an involuntary admission, which would fall under administrative court. So in that case, if they're forced to go to treatment, then they would go to a hospital that takes involuntary admissions. And then they would, if they're there for 10 days, then they have the right to a hearing with a public defender that's appointed to them. In most cases, I'd say that in most cases, they have met criteria for no longer involuntary admission or for discharge before those 10 days have kind of come come to fruition. So speaking of a crisis intervention team, so that's where I serve right now. CIT as a whole, so crisis intervention training, originally started within our department in 2000, where we really realized like, hey, we need to be able to provide more support, more training to the officers, especially in regards to mental health. So the goal and really the kind of the focus of the national CIT model is really to partner with community stakeholders to create a program that's a voluntary program for individuals who would be trained at a higher level for more mental health treatment, more de-escalation training, so that they would be able to understand and be able to really, the intent would be to really be able to communicate with those individuals at a different level. The start was minimal, and then instructors were in-house. I think it was really community-based. Currently, right now, we partner with our Health and Human Services to develop a training program, and it's kind of changed as we've gone along, as kind of society as a whole and our mental health approach has changed. Our department as a whole has definitely stayed with those changes and really tried to identify what are the best approaches to making sure that our officers are to a point where they are the best trained that we can get them to be. Currently, our centralized team, which is the 5 officers, the clinician, and the sergeant, these are the types of calls that we respond to when we're working. We have active crisis calls, so those types of calls that are actively going on, those are priority calls. We oversee our training, and we'll get into a little bit more about that. Chronic cases are more the cases that the repeat calls for service, where we try to have a different approach so that we can try to eliminate or really reduce the amount of chronic calls we have. We assist other agencies like CPS, APS. We assist other departments or units within our own department as well. Any kind of follow-up, and then emergency response team. So the training itself, really kind of the focus was that we really kind of had a voluntary program. And really what we have seen is what the CIT model as a whole really wanted to be a voluntary program. We put a focus on mental health training as one where from immediately leaving the academy, it's one of the first calls you're going to go to. So being able to provide at least a foundation is pretty important, and understanding how important it is that our officers really understand mental health treatment, de-escalation, communication skills, which is very imperative, really focus on moving towards 100% participation in CIT. And used to be, you had the option of CIT, but everybody was trained in mental health first aid. And now we're really moving towards 100% of all of our officers being trained. The training itself is 40 hours of training to our officers now. And then we also have assisted with other agencies in the state. And then we partner with Health and Human Services. Right now, we currently conduct about 4 to 5 trainings a year. And after each training, we talked about how do we evaluate how much of the participants, their feedback goes into adjusting, adapting, changing the training for the next class. We evaluate every session, every day of those days. And we really sit down with our partners at HHS on a continuous basis and identify really what do we like to change? What do we feel like would be a better use of our time? And really what message are we really getting to our students? But really kind of type of topics that we really kind of hit on. Really de-escalation is a huge part. It's interwoven within almost every segment that we do. We do a broad overview of mental disorders, mental health laws, which is really important because that's kind of what dictates what we do. Crisis communication, and what community resources are available for not only our officers, but our officers can then provide that information for their everyday interactions with those on the street. We talked about the CIT model as a whole. It actually came off the Memphis model, which was developed in 1988. And really, you've seen where it was very much a partner agency where it was voluntary. We've seen it really kind of progress and really kind of adapt to the society as a whole, where we used to have crisis intervention team. Now we have actually crisis response intervention training, which is like CRIT, which is the curriculum that really supports the Department of Justice, that really supports the CIT model. And they provide a lot of resources and information. And one of the biggest things that we've seen with that is a huge focus on individuals with autism and intellectual disabilities, which really wasn't a larger focus in the past, but they've definitely made it a larger focus moving forward, which foundationally, as we see as a society, we see a lot more individuals with a dual diagnosis of autism or an intellectual disability, as well as a mental illness. So really their basic goal is to really develop the most compassionate and effective crisis response system that is the least intrusive in a person's life, and to help persons with mental disorders and or addictions access medical mental health treatment rather than place them in the criminal justice system due to illness-related behaviors. So the benefits that we saw within our department, which we can see overall, is really reduces departmental liability, failure to train, and that even Lieutenant Jensen, we talk about one thing we've had in the past was that there really wasn't that much of a focus within the academy because they come back for CIT. She's been great being able to accommodate, understanding that maybe we can hit on a little bit more mental health training within the academy before they graduate. It also increases patrol officer de-escalation skills, reduces work-related injuries, reduces injuries to persons with mental illness and developmental disabilities, and improves relationship with the community, and improves interdepartmental relationships. So things that we actually respond to now, active calls. So if we are, usually there's 2 to sometimes 5 or 6 of us on the road, and things that we would respond to are suicides in progress, critical school incidents, actively violent mental health consumers, mental health, autism, IDD, critical missing individuals, any appropriate call regarding a mental health, autism, IDD, where an officer may need assistance. And really, some of those seem pretty straightforward, but really sometimes it just takes listening to the radio and understanding that a call that may go out as a trespassing call or even like a theft call. If you listen to it, you can understand that it has a mental health component and that you would be really you would benefit the call to go and try to navigate as much as you can and really assist patrol as much as you can. There are other times when officers will get on scene and they can request a CIT officer if they feel like it would be beneficial to them and what they may need on scene. So some of our chronic cases, those are our ongoing cases, continuous calls for service, things where we sometimes try an outside the box approach to try to really change the behavior as much as we can. There are times with our behavioral assessment threats unit, we can assist them with follow-ups as well as on like check the welfare. We go and we do assessments. We work with our HHS partners and really try to identify what the need of that individual is and how can we really help them so that we are no longer having the repeat calls or service or the repeat interactions with their neighbors that may be negative. Ongoing escalating behavior, and then at times utilizing the judicial system for treatment, which is utilizing our problem-solving courts here in Montgomery County. So the problem with diversion programs is that you actually have to have a criminal charge to be able to put them in a diversion program, which is at times really counterproductive to what we want to do. So when we're assisting in calls, we have the competency process, which is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the clinical assessment and transition services. They're out of jail, they're out of the CPU, Central Processing Unit. And there are times where if someone is held over for bond review, and it depends on a few factors of whether they're held over for bond review from the commissioner, we have the opportunity to really kind of communicate with CATS and ask for a psychiatric evaluation. So that usually kind of comes into play if they're held over for bond review, which allows us, because bond reviews are always held at like 1 p.m. the next business day. So it was in room 513 at the courthouse. I've been there a few times. But in that time period in between, that allows CATS to really kind of do a psychiatric evaluation and make sure that is there a competency issue? And if so, would they benefit from it's a psychiatric evaluation through our psychologist up at Clarksburg. So there's a lot that kind of come into it because sometimes those clinicians don't have all the information that we can provide, and that we work pretty close together to understand, really kind of provide that information to the clinician that would be evaluating them. When we decide regarding, sometimes the charge is already there, so it's kind of out of our hands, but we really have to weigh the safety of the individual with the long-term impact of legal charges. The diversion program, we have mental health court, the homeless docket, as well as the drug docket. And then sometimes because mental health, they're all voluntary programs, and sometimes individuals with severe mental illness aren't as insightful to understanding their illness as a whole. So they may be resistant to voluntarily going into mental health court. So sometimes we advocate for mental health treatment as part of a plea deal, if that's possible, because we really like the long-term goal really being treatment rather than any kind of discipline action. So the three problem-solving courts here in Montgomery County and in Maryland that we utilize, I utilize mental health court all the time. It's a dedicated docket used to divert defendants who have committed crimes because of a severe, persistent mental illness away from prosecution in jail and into a structured, individualized program. Again, it's a voluntary program. Circuit court, there's a circuit court mental health court, as well as a district court mental health court. Both are really easy to work with. Anytime I have a situation, I'm first to give them a call and make the referral so that they understand the situation and work with. They have to talk to the state's attorney to see if they're in agreement with it, but then they assess. And if you're familiar with mental health court, it's actually pretty great to see. It's a usually 12 months to 18 months voluntary program. It's a combination of a treatment team with a judge, as well as usually the public defender and the state's attorney. And they follow the individuals on a 2 to 3 times a week basis to make sure that they are actively in treatment, that there's no really change in behavior. The one thing that we find is that sometimes when we see that we have interactions that are coming back, we can reach out to mental health court to ask and say, hey, I believe that this individual is in your program and we're seeing this change of behavior, whether it was calling 911 frequently, we see that increase, we can reach out to them. And rather than it kind of go through court, we can approach the treatment team and say, we see this, we want you to be aware of it. And they bring it to the treatment team and say, we understand that part of this is baseline, but we are seeing this change of behavior. What can we do as a therapeutic approach to kind of change it? So it's a good exchange of thoughts there. The homeless persons criminal diversion program, which I believe started about 1.5 years ago, which is a great opportunity for individuals that are currently unhoused in the community. And then the adult drug docket, which has been around for a while. Other additional responsibilities that we have, at times we respond to the emergency response team, which is the ERT callouts, in our approach where we can engage with the families and get any other information, working with HHS, other clinicians on scene. We have found that sometimes families may be apprehensive to provide us information as officers, but they can provide information to clinicians and feel a little bit in a better relationship and a better status with that. Some of our ongoing extensive cases, like escalating behavior, we have seen a really large increase with co-occurring disorders, people with autism or IDD, and a mental health diagnosis. We have tried a treatment team approach where we worked with the individuals, obviously with the patient's consent, or in some cases the parent and patient's consent, with their clinicians to develop individual behavior plans, to identify the criminal behavior in essence, and how we can change that behavior and other options that they have, and provide a resource for them to self-report so that we can move towards a better outcome. We work with threat assessments, the crisis center, mobile crisis teams, assistance, and then APS and CPS assistance as well. All right, so one thing we are working towards is the CIT joint response model, which I think we've seen as really kind of nationwide, has been more adapted in other agencies. What does that look like? It's a police officers and clinicians work in team approach to respond to mental health calls for service, together providing an improved and immediate response to crisis situations by conducting a more accurate needs assessment on scene for the person in distress. and connecting them and their families to community-based resources. Currently, I think we're recruiting for clinical positions that would our social worker on staff would supervise them as well. I actually don't know where that stands right now. Frederick City has a model. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. They have what they call the crisis car, where they have I think there's an officer in the car, a clinician, and I think they just added a paramedic there. The interesting thing about that is that it actually is a program through Shepherd Pratt. So it's a van, and the van actually has modeled all over it like Shepherd Pratt Global Crisis. And it's interesting because really a software approach it's a little bit difficult when you really kind of come out to the community with a van that kind of has it all over the side. So those officers that serve in that came through our CIT training. That was actually the first training that they had in January of this year. So they kind of came to us for their CIT training. So I think they're trying to adapt it, make it a little bit more really what better way to serve the community. But it seems to be doing okay. Any questions so far?
I do have one question, Officer Cox, and thank you for your service. And at times, mental health issues can be quite challenging, right? So you said that you guys are recruiting for new positions, right? I'm curious, how big is the CIT team, and how many cases do you guys respond on a regular basis, on a yearly basis?
Well, I actually don't have the statistics right in front of me, but I'm happy to get it for you. We currently have, for the centralized CIT team, which is those individuals that only respond to these types of calls for severely mentally ill individuals, there are 5 officers and there's a sergeant. Roughly, we respond to it can be 3 to 4 calls a day. Sometimes it's more. It really kind of depends on, there's a full moon, I'll say 2 weeks ago, if anybody saw it, which people kind of say, oh, that doesn't change kind of the acuteness of the community, but it does. We had an extreme increase in calls for service. So it's in start of school, because sometimes it's situational. Start of school sometimes increase that. But really, we try to be as available to the individuals as possible and do what we can to really kind of help not only patrol, because when we respond to calls for our patrol calls for service, it's really not only is it us to help assist, but it's also trying to also educate our officers if we know a little bit more information. One thing we try to do within our CIT unit is really trying to do ongoing training. We are currently securing, we did research on Relias, which is a healthcare systems. It's a educational base library foundation where for ongoing training and educational services, they provide a library for mental health, for behavioral health, for other aspects that really for individuals to get more information, whether it could be on individuals with schizophrenia or thought disorders or mood disorders. So they get a little bit more information as we go on. So we have started that in January, and should be securing that in the next few weeks.
So if I understand correctly, you have currently 6 officers as part of the CIT team and 3 to 4 calls a day, and you're recruiting for how many? 2 to 3?
So those are our centralized. We are moving towards every one of our officers being trained in CIT. I think roughly they're at 90%, we'll be at 100%. We are currently recruiting for clinicians. So those clinical spots would ride in vehicles with our officers.
Got it. So right now, if a 911 call gets made and the officer is at a situation where there's a mental health issue, emergency mental health issue, so I also heard this 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. If it's outside that time frame, then essentially what happens if the officer is at the location?
Well, it depends on the type of call, but we have on-call. There's always officers. There's an on-call schedule. So we're available. Sometimes it could be by phone call. We could be a resource for them on by phone. Other times they could they could easily call us. We can come out and assist in any way that we can, and lead them and provide any kind of resource that we can. And sometimes it could be a situation like, hey, this is how I handle the situation. Can you follow up tomorrow? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's I follow up with CPS and with CATS, or I can follow up with the hospital to get a better understanding where that individual is.
Got it. So if we can get the numbers on the number of
Oh,
the
yeah,
case
I'd be happy to.
statistics, that'll be great. Okay, so
And I apologize if Captain Sotinsky was here, he would know them off the top of his head.
okay, no worries.
He's very
Thank
well
you.
versed.
Okay, I have a question here. I think you said that about 90% of the officers trained at this point or went through training. That's not my question, but I just want to point. And you say they are trained for 40 hours. What I want to know about the 40 hours is this. How often do they get trained? Is it like, or retrain, or if they just get 40 hours and that's it forever and ever and a day while they are being an officer? I just want to give my point of view of something like that, is that if they are trained for 40 hours and they're not, say, retrain or go through the training again in 3 years, I think
No, I totally understand that, right? Like so many things have changed, especially the mental health world within 20 years. So an officer that came in 20 years ago that got it, everything that's changed in that time would be like incredible. But in regards to the 90, so the 90%, we talk about CIT training, that's 40 hours. That right now is roughly at 90%. It's kind of a combination of trying to bring in those that haven't gotten it, as well as those that are right out of the academy and those classes that we have, but they would be moving to 100%. If you haven't received it, though, you have received the 8-hour mental health first aid class, because that was rolled out a few years ago, but no longer in existence, as we're now going to everyone is being CIT trained. So everybody's had that. Every year there's a CIT mental health component. So we're required for ongoing training every year through the state. Part of that segment is ongoing training within the mental health components, whether it's sometimes it's mental health laws, and sometimes it's also just different trends that we see, or refreshers on diagnosis and different disorders that we're going to see. But every year they receive some kind of component to it.
Good. Just based on positions classifications, are there certain officers get trained first, like the officers on the street who has to have more community interaction? Are they given priority training, or they get training first, or whatever?
There is a priority based on kind of your interaction, and then kind of how the list goes would be those that are like really kind of really in the field, and how much interaction they're going to have and the ability to use the skills. But then at the same time, kind of like as we say, like on the bottom of the list are those individuals that may have been here, there may be in a specialized unit that really doesn't really have that much need for CIT training, but as an officer, they do. So they may be a little lower on that list. But again, as we work through the list, as we incorporate the new individuals that are coming out of the academy. So right now, roughly when they come out of the academy, they could follow through their FTO program. They do get a little bit of CIT within the academy, kind of like just the basics. And then they go through their FTO program. And then usually roughly kind of depending on when the class comes out and when they've graduated, maybe 2 to 3 months, maybe like up to 6 months, then they're in the CIT class, which I honestly, I do believe that there's a huge benefit for having it in the academy, at least having a foundation in the academy. But then once they're able to get out and see those types of calls for service that they respond to, have a little bit more experience when they come back to CIT, so that they can kind of build off of that and really have something to really understand when they're responding to these calls, to kind of have a foundation, like, actual calls that they've responded to that they can really kind of pull from and ask specific questions.
One other thing I want to ask about is that dealing with the involuntary and voluntary mental health treatment situation. When you're dealing with 12-year-old, I just want to ask if the 12-year-old can ask for volunteer treatment or whatever intervention, and the parents do not want to do that, how does that work?
Well, we actually have
I
not,
don't-
I'm not on wood that we have not come across that yet. Usually kind of within, especially when we talk to individuals about guardianship and psychiatric advance directives, those that allow other people to make have decision-making rights for individuals regarding healthcare as adults. With that, obviously if a parent wants their child to be assessed, then they have that right to take them to the hospital. Whether we decide to emergency petition or not. In that regard, we luckily haven't had to face it, but it would be a context regarding they would be able to seek that treatment. I mean, I think that would be a conversation that we would have with that 12-year-old. The law was changed, and which I really kind of appreciated those individuals within that 12 to 16 age gap where especially as society as a whole, we really put a focus on mental health. Really, those individuals that want a treatment, but we're kind of in that area of like, hey, parents don't really support it. They don't agree with it. They could still seek out treatment. The flip on that, though, is that you still need parental consent for medication. So, but that's more of a healthcare question. That's not really a question for us. In the case where we have an individual, especially a child who would meet criteria and we're worried that child could be a danger to themselves or others, then we would fall to being able to take that person to the hospital to be evaluated.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions?
Hi, it's Terry Walsh.
Yes.
And I apologize. I raised my hand twice. I didn't mean to do that. Nice to meet you. Thank you. My question is, how does the general public get triaged? And this comes from a personal experience I had where I called 311 and I was concerned about the mental health of an individual. And I was directed to call the crisis intervention team because I was concerned about the mental health. And when I called the crisis team, they told me that they couldn't do anything other than call the police. So as a everyday individual who is concerned about the mental health of someone, tell me how it works and how it should work, and ideally how it plays out in everyday life now with your team.
So obviously, depending on the nature of the call, if it's a behavioral emergency, then definitely call 911. With understanding that the majority, based on kind of statistics, the majority of those individuals responding, whether it's a centralized CIT officer or not responding, would be CIT trained. That's the most important. If it's one where it falls into that, I understand that they need treatment, but they're resistant to treatment. I don't feel like they're in immediate danger to themselves that I need to call the police. What are your options? Well, there's a few. You called the crisis center, and I don't know why they said they didn't have to call the police. It may have been whatever that situation was. They felt like there could be an issue. Can I ask how long ago that was?
Probably when it started to get cold, because again, the person seemed to have some type of. I'm a nurse too, so
most recently. Okay,
it's
so
probably 3 weeks ago. So yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
So I apologize because I know that in the past, when you called mobile crisis or crisis center for mobile crisis assessment, it used to be that they, for the most part, always had the police with them. So that may have been the approach. Most recently, within I think the last 2 years, they've gone to approach where they've kind of been able to kind of triage the call itself and identify, is that something that we want the police to kind of go with us, or we feel like we can go, and if it ends up being a situation where we need the police, we can call them later. That's kind of the model and I obviously spoke pretty broadly. They could speak more eloquently on that, but that's kind of the model that they follow now. Then also sometimes there's situations where they'll call us directly if it's a more dynamic case and they're a little bit would like our assistance on it. In those cases, if you're calling for a nurse, and whether it's like a patient or even like a family member, nurse is a little bit different, where I don't know if you would like to apply for the petition. If you feel like you're not getting really an answer with the crisis center, you can always go down to the commissioner, go down to the district courthouse, and you can complete an emergency petition. There are times where I feel like family members are the biggest advocates for their loved ones, especially when they understand like the cycle of that individual's behavior and what their baseline is. And they, for the most part, can articulate the best why they feel like that person's a danger. Sometimes as police officers, we get just what we see in front of us, but you guys as family or loved ones are really kind of invested people can tell a bigger story. So you can go to the courthouse and you can complete that form. I think they give you a whole other page to really write out why you really feel like that person's a danger. I always tell family members to include kind of like any kind of like recent changes in behavior, activities of daily living that you've seen, a decrease in kind of their behavior, their interactions with others, like paint the bigger picture, or even in the past, like in the past, they've been not med compliant. In the past, we see that the cycle is that they get severely depressed and then we have this kind of aggressive episode. So you guys as a family member or an invested party can really kind of paint a picture that sometimes we cannot see. So you can always go down there and apply for the emergency petition. If it's granted, it goes over to the sheriffs and they serve it. With mobile crisis, with the crisis center, sometimes it's one where I'm not really sure why they said that we'd have to respond unless they felt like there was like a safety issue. But you can also, if that individual is willing to come in for treatment, then they can assess at the crisis center as well. At the end of this, I provide all of our contact information for our CIT team. You can always reach out to us if you kind of feel like you're at a loss of where to go. And we could try to point you in the right direction. To at least provide some kind of resources and some answers. So I hope I answered that for you.
Yes, and
You can
it wasn't as much personal, and my camera's not working right. So anyway, I apologize. I turned it on,
Oh, no.
but it wasn't as much personal as, as a community member, how do we know where to point everybody to go in the right direction, where we really don't want, a police intervention, but you really need the mental health intervention that's appropriate and possibly can be escalated. And I think that's the bigger question for me.
It's definitely difficult of kind of the best approach. I know that, and I don't know if this is obviously totally different, but we also I know the Montgomery County put out like a QR code, and I think it's like 85 pages now of all the different resources that are available in the county. And the QR code actually allows you, it's supposed to be kept live so that you can access it and see exactly what resources you might need for. I ran into someone today who is unhoused, and they had walked into like a synagogue looking for services. So they had asked me if I knew any where I could point them in the right direction. So I shared the QR code as well, but was able to kind of really provide a lot of information, just kind of pull up the QR code and see what's all available for the individual, like right at that moment. As well as like any kind of phone numbers. And it's a great way, a great tool, really to kind of keep easily accessible that you might need later on. So all of our officers have it as well. We try to share it as much as we can.
Thanks, Kelly. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? I want to be respectful of time. We have like 3. I'm sorry. There is one question. Mr.
This just came across that. One of the things I think most people, when it comes to mental health interaction with the police, the first thing is if you call the police and you say to them, this is a mental health situation, how does that impact how they respond when they get to you? I
mean, I definitely think it's important information to know in some capacity, but I find that what I'm finding within training as a whole is that we now respond more to the behavior rather than a diagnosis. And that's really kind of important when we look at people with intellectual disabilities or autism, because it's really kind of keeping the scene safe as quickly as possible, right? Bringing back that individual and then really kind of taking a step back and going, okay, what do we have, rather than how we respond to someone with like autism or IDD compared to someone that doesn't have that diagnosis. Really, we're there to really kind of calm the situation as much as possible, right? So, but at the same time, it's important to know when we kind of respond to scenes, does that person respond to auditory hallucinations? Because it may change. Or when I interact with individuals, I try to identify if I can see if they're responding to hallucinations, especially command hallucinations to kill other people. Like that's really important for us to know. But at the same time, not other officers will be able to identify that pretty easily on. So again, we kind of, from a police officer approach, we are really trying to get as much information before we get to scene as we can, but understanding that when we get there, it may not be accurate information, and really kind of approaching the situation as a whole as we can, and keeping everyone safe as much as possible. So understanding it's a mental health call is really important. It really is. At the same time, though, our approach should really be to subdue the situation as much as possible. And I'm finding that our officers are doing a pretty good job at that. On a total side note, there was a call for service for an individual. I had a meeting on Thursday, so I was unable to go. I believe the call went out for an individual who was disrobing in the street, and then and that again, that it wouldn't come out as a mental health call, but if like listening to the call, you would say, okay, that would be something that would be very appropriate for me to go to. Unfortunately, I was unable to go because I was called into this meeting I couldn't get out of. But I was able to actually talk to the gentleman's wife the next day, who said that the officers that responded on the scene were fantastic and really did a really good job of really engaging with the individual. He was in a psychotic state, and being able to talk them into going into the hospital to be assessed voluntarily without any kind of use of force, just by communicating with them. So it was always good to hear that it was a non-centralized CIT officer that was able to do that, kind of just based on interactions and their ongoing training.
Thank you.
So I do believe this ends at 8, correct? I just quickly okay. I can quickly kind of go over just kind of type of cases that we kind of go to, so you can kind of see, and that should take a couple minutes, but we won't go into too much of detail. In regards to the first one, it's just an individual who recently worked for the federal government, was terminated. His family actually applied for the emergency petition. He believed that the individuals in his apartment were working against him, and he started to target them, kind of building this paranoia to where he physically assaulted them. So there was also charges as well for the individual. So that was like on a Friday. Additional call for service went out that Monday in the afternoon, where they were familiar with the officer or with the individual. They engaged him. He started to verbally assault the neighbor. Police officers engaged him in the apartment complex, where he actually charged them with a knife, but then he was able to retreat into the apartment, where for over 6 hours, they tried to engage in conversation with him to have him removed from the apartment. In that, kind of our role in that too is kind of building as much information as possible. We understood doing our research that there was an emergency petition on file, as well as charges. So within the state law, it says that emergency petition always kind of overrides the charge or the warrant. And in that case, you can totally see that, right? As the state standing is that the immediate need for evaluation and treatment overrides and the need to serve the warrant. The charges will be there. Their mental health actually should take precedent, and it did. So we were able to coordinate services regarding the ER, and making sure that they were treated at the ER, and then their next steps, and then service of the warrant. Kind of where we live, it's a little area. It's interesting. This is an individual with an autism diagnosis as well as a mental health diagnosis, where I've actually worked on this case for like 2 years, 2.5 years now, where we have numerous calls for service with the individual. And we've had some criminal behavior as well, where he's been driving his vehicle towards officers, multiple threats in the neighborhood. And really what we were able to do is we did individualized behavior plans, but really focused on, became a little bit concerned from a security detail that was near their house, where we really need to focus on his behavior could be detrimental to him, and that's concerning. So he ended up, of April this year, another call for service where a individual on Discord, which I had to learn a lot about, called for him based on kind of threatening behaviors that he made, where kind of he admitted to attempting to swat this individual. So based on that, we charged to put him in diversion court, where he currently is in treatment. They stepped the charge, and he's in treatment in Georgia right now, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. It's really just kind of treatment to kind of change the behavior. And then if you guys are familiar with this one, this was our assistance with the behavioral assessment unit, where the teenager wrote the 129-page manifesto. So we assisted those individuals or that team with going to the house and bringing the individual under emergency petition to the hospital. And then kind of based on that behavioral assessment, we did an consent search, but then they did a more extensive search of the individual and identified a lot more information that was a little bit more concerning. Again, identifying that the risk to all the other students at the school kind of was really at play there. So that's kind of our assistance in that one as well. Any questions after all that? Great. These are all of our contact information, numbers, our emails. You're more than welcome. Mine's right there. Please don't hesitate. You can always reach out to me. I try to be always available. Sometimes email or texting is easier, but if you have any questions, please let me know. This is kind of just a brief overview. So, sorry, Susan, did you have a question?
Yes. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Could you send us your PowerPoint presentation?
I would be happy to. Susan,
That
could I
would be
send
awesome.
it to you?
Yeah,
and
just
you
send
could
it to me and I'll
distribute
send it out to the commission.
Perfect. Great. I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And again, if you have any questions after this, or you have a personal story or a very specific question, I usually, if I don't have the answer, I can usually find it. Happy to help. I will stop sharing on that.
That's great. I really appreciate it. And I will be in touch with you if anybody has any follow-up questions.
Wonderful.
So thank you again. Thank you to everyone for your time on this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, there's another question in the chat.
The question is, do you have any information on how many calls you're engaging in or missed opportunities of calls that CIT could have or should have engaged in? I'm actually going to ask Captain Skidmore, or excuse me, Captain Stajinsky to provide that information. He has he's got a good finger on the pulse of all of that. It is difficult to know because, again, the hours that we work is very kind of limited. At the same time, I'm a big believer that crisis does not go between 9 to 5, right? If it is, everybody's job would be so much easier, right? Just kind of happen during the day, so we don't inconvenience anyone. But we kind of have to work with what we have. So it is difficult to know how many calls that we would be able to respond to. But I would get what information I can for you.
Okay, I'll put that in writing too and send it to you.
I do have one question, which you may not be able to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Young man, his name was Ryan. Can't remember his last name right now. But anyway, it was an incident in the McDonald's drive-thru. I think that was in Gaithersburg, where the CIT Ryan LaRue, thank you, where the crisis intervention team had been called, but hadn't gotten there yet, and the police proceeded anyway. So what I'm curious about, and subsequently shot him and killed him. So what I'm curious about is what is the protocol here? you know, if you all have been called, what is, you know, like the waiting period? How does that flow? Are you all, if you all have been called, are you then, is there a subsequent conversation with the responding officers about, you know, what's going on? If you could explain the protocol, I'd appreciate it.
Currently, when we're in service, and I oversee, I'm usually in like in Bethesda area, but I listen to the radio and I listen to all the stations at the same time, which honestly can be very confusing. But just to see it, I look at the we have a computer that kind of dictates all the calls that are going on. Because again, some of the calls that go out don't really seem like, if it goes out as like a trespassing or vandalism, but I listen to the call, I realize, hey, there's something that's really something that I need to respond to. It's more appropriate that I respond to as well. Or if a different district requests a CIT officer available, and let's say we are then like 3 or 4 of us based on the level of call or in a different unit, I always say, hey, show me en route. I'm happy. I'm on my way, but understanding like we have such a large county, sometimes it's difficult. But I also ask that officer to call me so that I have and I'm pulling up the call as well, but to call me so that I have an understanding of what's going on at that time, to understand really the sense of urgency and really like, do you feel like you can make this call? Do you need more information? There are times where I've had officers just say, hey, this is what I have. I don't know how to articulate it. I don't see what I have. What do you think? And sometimes it's just a conversation, or sometimes it's like, hey, I'm on my way. And really kind of based on the pressing matter. Sometimes it is a priority call that we do go to on scene, but it is a open communication as soon as we then engage in that conversation. At times, sometimes they don't even request us, but we can look and see that like, hey, that's something that I just want to touch base and see if there's anything that you might need from me as they're responding to that call. So we try to be as communicative as we can with patrol to see if we can be a resource or if we're available to help, even on our way over there, even if they've requested us.
I guess, you know, I appreciate that. I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether there is a formalized protocol. You know, like if you called us, you go back off. I mean, what is there a formalized protocol? Because what you're describing sounds sort of like an ad hoc response, which, you know, maybe that's the best practice. I don't know, but you know, it sounds like there's not a formalized protocol. Am I correct in making that that conclusion?
Not necessarily. They've taken the steps to identify what calls that we would be dispatched to. So not even things that we would add ourselves to, but that we're dispatched to. Whether that they're called, it's a violent MO, which would be a behavior emergency for an individual. So we are dispatched to that call, as well as suicide in progress. Those are the calls that we are dispatched to. So we are attached to that call. In regards to the other calls, it depends on really kind of very situational. Really understanding though, unfortunately, I don't like mental health calls are always going to be, we're going to see more and more substantial calls. Is that really kind of the training the officer? So the focus, I mean, 90% of our officers are CIT trained. So they've been through the training. So whether it's a centralized officer or not, there are officers, like majority of our officers in the field have had at least those 40 hours of training, if not more, as well as the yearly training that they get. And knowing that we're a resource, and there's times I go and we do roll call training. So we go to roll calls and we'll do training on what they may have current situations of what we're seeing as trends and any way that we can be available resource to them. So it's taking, I mean, kind of did the statistics earlier of how many people are really impacted by severe mental illness, and having 5 people to do the whole county is difficult, but how do we then serve the county the best we can with what we have? And it's really training the officers that we have and utilizing the officers that are in a centralized position to be as resource as much as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I also think that there are probably a lot of people who are not necessarily diagnosed with mental health conditions that, you know, at any point, I think anybody can kind of break, you know?
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah.
so, you know, what I'm gathering, and I don't want to, I don't want to put you on the spot, but so it sounds like there are two different categories of responses, if you will. Or I don't want to say responses. There are two different categories of what could happen. Okay, it sounds like from what you're saying, and like I said, I don't want to draw the wrong conclusion, but it sounds like from what you were saying, if you all are called, then there might be a set of protocols. But if you all sort of see it on the screen and decide this might be someplace I need to be, then it becomes a more ad hoc, a more fluid situation. Is that what the best practices are?
To an extent, it's kind of the approach of how do we really engage and be involved in as many causes as we can for service. So while they've identified, hey, these are the calls that we feel like are important that they're dispatched to, right? Those are the ones that we go to. We've also kind of identified like being proactive and identifying those that we would feel like were appropriate. A case in point would be, excuse me, it's actually a trespassing call on private property. And then kind of listening through it, realized that the individual was obviously experiencing a really behavioral crisis and having a psychotic episode. So I added myself to that call, right? And I once I got on scene, then we could really assess the situation, identifying that she's responding to auditory hallucinations. And so kind of developed a kind of a plan of action based on that. Unfortunately, every situation that we get, really every call that we go to is very, very individualized and very situational based on the complexity of what we're going to. But at the same time, it's kind of like a multi-tiered approach where we are dispatching these calls. We're responding to as many calls as we can for service as we see them happening. Any kind of major incident, we also work together to kind of group as a team respond to as well. But then also being available by phone call if anything happens, like even in the middle of the night or during the day as well. So it's communicating with our officers in each district as well, so that they know that we're available. Because sometimes it's just a question of like, hey, I don't know what I could have done in this situation. What are the resources available? So I seem like I engage in the information a lot, and I seem pretty well versed in it. But then I also have to realize that sometimes people are not as well. So I have to be able to like provide as much resources and information as I can of what we can do.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Then I can mute and will be available for any other questions if you have them.
Thank you, Officer Cox. I really appreciate it. If that's it, then I think everybody can sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.